Racist neighbor calls cops on wedding, then they realize who the couple really is. When a racist neighbor summoned the police to the wedding, officials answered with violence and arrests, but after the identity of the bride and groom are known. Their acts have unanticipated results. Will the newlyweds be able to avoid missing fresh news? And write in the comments where Justice subscription allows. From The Sun, you are seeing this as the sun sets over the immaculately cut hedges of the posh neighborhood, throwing a pleasant golden light over the backyard of a big, graceful house. The happy hum of guests mixing and partying under strings of glitter filled the home. Lights, a gentle breeze carrying the wonderful aroma of flowers from the well-placed centerpieces, so adding a bit of the beauty of nature suited the happy occasion a wedding was meant for, and the grins on everyone's faces revealed the love and hope the newlywed couple shared. Standing among their friends and relatives, Emma and David embodied the idea of contentment. Emma is a revered judge noted for her ethics and relentless. Her white outfit made her committed to justice look brilliant, and her grin radiated as brilliantly as David, her husband, a senior FBI agent, stood facing the setting sun. Tall next to her, his arm encircling her shoulders, a great respect in his view. Their love was clear in every exchanged gaze and every silent phrase. Both they and their guests were equally delighted to be part of their unique celebration. The couple decided to have their wedding at their house, somewhere that would naturally represented their shared aspirations and the life David had created alongside her. Put out great effort to design a backyard that seemed both private and transparent, a place where their closest friends and relatives might join in celebration. Emma's parents proud of their daughter's accomplishments, mixed with visitors telling tales of her youth and delivering sincere congratulations. David's family, many of whom had flown from all across, smiled and toasted to the future sounds of newlyweds merging with the gentle melody filling the backdrop. Unknown to them, only a few homes down the street, an elderly woman sat in her living room staring through her lace curtains. Mrs. Rose, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, had long been renowned for her sharp tongue and her inclination to interfere in the affairs of people nowadays. Her brows widened as she observed the gathering in David and Emma's backyard, lines of deep frowning etched there. She had seen many things over her years living here, but a celebration like this among people she thought out of place aroused a Mrs. Rose's usual wrath. Surged for her phone with bony fingers. Holding it securely, she dialed a number she knew all too well and sharply and angrily contacted the police. She spun a narrative of loud noise and strange behavior originating from the house along the street. She indicated possible criminal activity in her statements. Driven by subtly veiled prejudice, by the time she hung her image was far from the actuality of the happy assembly in the precinct. The dispatcher answered the call, and a few on-duty cops exchanged eyes. It was a peaceful evening, and the opportunity to answer a call regarding a possible incident in an upscale area caught their attention. Without much thought, a group of cops was sent to look at the picture, their faces stiffening with expectation as they moved toward the while back at the house, the atmosphere stayed blissfully ignorant of the Emma, nearing storm, was deep in discussion with her childhood buddy, sharing anecdotes and jokes while David discussed with his uncle an approaching family. Children ran around the yard, their laughing mixing with the clinking of glasses as toasts were given. The visitors spoke without realizing the tension developing just outside the boundaries of their rejoicing as Emma and the heavens sank into pink and purple tones. David told friends of a dance, their motions elegant and joyful. Pals and family gathered around, clapping in time with the rhythm to light their faces. They would always remember that by the warm glow of the lights it was a fleeting ideal picture of togetherness and love untouched by the world. Outdoors, but beyond the hedge, headlights from the dusk rumbled police across their land. Cars slowing down disturbed the evening's peace, even though none in particular in the yard first saw it. The cops got out from their cars, changing their belts and quick words as they got ready to approach. Their eyes looked about the place, Although their facial expressions lacked any indication of acknowledging the joyful occasion playing out before them, the first indication of problems arose when a younger visitor observed the flashing lights bouncing off the house windows. A whisper went across the assembly as more people turned to view the police car line parked. Outside, David sensed the change in the air and softly let Emma approach the cause of the disturbance. His face changed from joy to worried. What's happening? Emma wrinkled her forehead and looked toward. David's hands were gently soothing, but a knot of anxiety was developing in his own chest, and he could see. As the tall man approached, his hands resting on his holsters, the resolve shone in the officer expressions. Stepping forward with a stern look, he yelled his voice across the night air. We had heard accounts about everyone in this disruption must stay where they are. David and Emma exchanged a brief, silently consenting to be cool. Emma, always the professional, moved forward to greet the evening cops. ERS, this is A. Our wedding is a private event, and there is a miscommunication with the officer's gaze rushed over the gathering and wrinkled. We have heard of dubious activities and possible noise breaches. We will need to. David understood that tone of speech. The tightness of his stomach was caused from one who discounted any justification before it was ever offered, yet maintained a calm voice as he talked. Officer, this is just a wedding celebration. We would be pleased to respond to any inquiries you have, but there's no cause for alarm here. The officer's expression didn't soften. Instead, he waved to his colleagues, cops who started to disperse around the audience, exuding power. The visitors who had first believed this would be a straightforward misinterpretation started to become uncomfortable as the cops asked them their attitude, and Emma's parents watched with far from friendliness. Growing concern on their pale cheeks under the lights. David's brother, a lawyer, tried to intervene to provide legal advice, but the cops shrugged him off, saying that appeared bored in hearing explanations. The happy ambience of the evening was fast turning into uncertainty and anxiety. Emma felt a knot of frustration blooming in her chest. She inhaled deeply to remind herself to stay calm. She understood they needed to act if they were going to defuse the matter. David stood beside her, maintaining their heads cool, his hand still on hers shoulder, offering a consistent presence among the growing conflict. Even with best attempts, they could see the change, the implicit prejudice in the way the police treated them, the contemptuous attitude in their voices. As Emma turned to face David, she could see the same insight in his eyes. This wasn't going to be a casual chat. It was the start of something far more alarming. The chapter finishes with David and Emma ignorant of the fact that this is standing together facing the police, determined to find fault where none exists. Confrontation will quickly spin out of control, threatening to eclipse what ought to have been the happiest day of their lives as the police kept on their path. Through the gathering, the joyous mood totally replaced by a reluctant silence that appeared to cover the garden like a fog. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the features of guests who exchanged uneasy looks and spoke among themselves. For a brief instant, it was as should time freeze an event intended to honor love and harmony. It was now eclipsed by suspicion and uncertainty. Emma and David stood next by side, observing as the police impatiently spoke with their friends and relatives. Using the tone was clearly condescending. Questions were not courteous questions, but subtly veiled charges. Emma could feel her pulse accelerating with every contemptuous glance, every rude retort the police handed to their visitors. Excuse me, officer, she called out. Her voice is calm but firm as she walked up to the lead cop who had first spoken. I know you're answering a complaint, but I can tell you there isn't any criminal conduct. This is a private event for which we have the required licenses and are not in breach of any ordinance. The officer turned to meet her eyes with a sweeping glance, mixture of doubt and frustration. We will be the judge of that, ma'am, he added, his tone contemptuous. He moved closer, his palm resting on his belt as though to make a statement. We need to do our research. David should help us forward, his expression within control but strong. Officer, my wife is a judge, he said, his voice even but clearly serious, and we are more than familiar with the law. We know our rights there. There is no need for this degree of examining the officer's gaze. They swung toward David, and a slight contemptuous. He mumbled, as if the words were of little importance, a smirk on his lips. He was a judge. Consequence, but that does not alter the reality that we learned of possible unlawful activity on this property. We should confirm what David's brother nearby had going on. Hearing the exchange moving forward, "I'm a lawyer," hence he interrupted. "Should you require any permissions or documentation, we would be pleased to confirm that everything here is in order." But instead of appreciating the offer, the officer just waved a hand dismissively and yelled, "We. You are not needed." The police made it abundantly enough that they lacked. Their desire in being reasonable or cooperative came from their need to assert their authority and the legal understanding of the visitors, no matter how large, was not going to stop them from acting. Hence the police started to probe the visitors more forcefully, their words filled with hints as one old attendee tried to clarify that this was a wedding celebration rather than some sort of suspicious gathering. The officer answered with a curt, "We'll see about that." Emma's father, seeing the growing conflict, he tried to intervene politely. "There is no need for this," he continued, his voice firm but worried. "Law-abiding folks, there is nothing here that calls for sir to back off." The lead officer snapped him off mid-sentence. "We will determine what warrants." Then David's eye caught one of the cops patting down. A young teenage visitor, who had arrived with his family, seems terrified. Maintained his hands raised while the officer searched him. "Is this truly necessary?" Rising gently, David called out, his voice speaking of a child he had done nothing wrong. The officer disregarded him, carrying on his search with the roughness that made the lad squirm. Emma's annoyance intensified as she observed the manner the youngest and oldest targets among them appeared to be targeted, as though to threaten and disempowerment the bunch as a whole. The officer said, her tone now more sharp as she walked up to the lead officer once more, "You are exceeding your authority. You have no justification for being examining our visitors like this." The lead cop turned to approach her once more, his expression stiffening. "Ma'am, should you keep interfering with our research, we must act against you." The words hanging in the air seem as a menace, and David sensed the people holding their breath momentarily and automatically placed with a hand on Emma's arm, not to restrain her, but to remind her they must keep calm regardless of the officer's rude behavior. Suddenly Emma retreated, her jaw set in a firm line. "I'm not intervening," she added, her voice steady. "I am exercising my rights, and the rights of everyone here must be handled fairly and respectfully." The lead officer's eyes darkened. "I advise you to start working, ma'am, else you will find yourself in." The visitors were aware of the harsh tone coming from the rear of a patrol car. Some of them started to speak up in David's and Emma's defense. One man claimed he couldn't do this. One man said his voice grew in protest. Another woman mentioned they hadn't done anything illegal. "This is harassment. There is no justification for any of this." "The more guests there are," objected the more. The police seemed to dig in their heels, their actions getting ever more hostile. Two cops started to split the visitors into smaller groups while others began requesting identification, as though the wedding's lawn had become suddenly a crime scene. Scenario. As David watched the scenario develop, a sinking feeling developed in the pit of his. Over his career, he had encountered several challenging circumstances, yet he never had. He felt so powerless against such obvious contempt for the law. It wasn't just a matter of authority being abused, was the officers' activities were motivated by an implicit prejudice, one that used their skin color as a reason for. Emma's mother, clearly startled, reached out to her daughter. Emma questioned, her voice shaking, what we were going to do, then squeezed her mother's hand gently, even though her own heart was racing with a mixture of wrath and. She answered, her voice cool, "Afraid we would let them scare us. Though internal conflict exists, we have laws on our side." Even as she spoke, she could see some of the police grinning as though they were having fun. One officer from the display of power started to stroll toward the home, as though meant to. Emma moved to intercept her as she searched the grounds without permission. She added furiously, "You need a warrant to enter the house. You do not have one, therefore." Stay where the officer turned to gaze back at her with a contemptuous sneer. Lady, tell me not how to perform my duties, as David kept headed toward the house. Walked in front of him, obstructing his route. You heard my wife say. Your voice is steady yet firm. You do not have the authority to enter our house. The officer's hand jerked toward his holster, a faint but clear threat. David commanded him to step aside. He stood his position facing the officer, without flinching not. Until you value our rights, he stated. At that very moment it became very evident how. Everyone here, this went beyond a noise complaint or the officer's behavior had passed a line, and the matter was sliding towards something considerably more severe than anyone could have predicted the next actions would. Find out if the story finishes with Emma with words or with violence. And David steadfastly refuses to back away even as the cops advance to create the conditions for a confrontation that would confront the very justice Emma had committed her life to and test their will. Maintaining the evening sky, formerly shown in vivid hues of twilight, has now came to terms with a deep and disturbing darkness, lit just by the police cars flashing red and blue lights in front of the house set the tone in the backyard. Went from nervous muttering to physical fear, and it was clear that the scene rapidly spiraling out of control. The police, now counting more than a dozen, started to grip the gathering. Their manner had become more angry, and their actions went beyond simple inquiry of a claimed disturbance. They were about establishing control over the guests who had first sought to reason with the police were now received strict orders and severe treatment, as though the backyard had suddenly turned into a battleground. Emma and David stood in the middle of the anarchy, attempting to hold their ground when the officer's aggressiveness escalated. Emma's responsibility as a judge had done nothing to discourage the cops. If anything, seemed to set off their reactions more when she reminded them of her position and the legal restrictions on their activities. She was laughed at. Glares and sarcastic laughter. Judge whether or not you are in a position to offer commands. One officer pushed past her, snarled, and his words sliced like a dismissiveness knife, but Emma will not allow the circumstances to quiet her. To descend without struggle close to the edge of the backyard. A small group of visitors had been obliged to kneel on the ground, their hands behind their heads. Several elderly relatives, clearly unhappy, were being guided by police who showed few regard for their age or health. Seemed as though all sort of decency or respect had been thrown away the instant David showed the first badge, as seeing his relatives received treatment like criminals sensed his blood boiling. His experience as a top FBI agent had showed him how to keep cool under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't an operation against threatening suspects. This was an attack on his family, and it was being done under the pretense of police enforcement. He closed his fist, resisting the want to act physically, since any unexpected motion could intensify the violence. Emma's voice boomed out over the lawn while she kept on. Contest the officer's actions. This is illegal. You cannot hold us without. Her statements were authoritative and unambiguous, a voice of reason among the anarchy, but her defiance seemed to just aggravate the officer's animosity. Keep talking, and we'll make ensuring you're the first to reach for an officer's hand. Back off, moving dangerously. David observed one of close proximity, near the baton tied on his waist. One of the younger guests, a teenage lad, was being forcefully patrolled by the police. The lad, unable to be more than 14, was shaking as the officer roughly searched him. His hands shook in the air, and he battled to restrain tears. Free your hands, David yelled. Unable to control his indignation, he rushed, approaching the officer, swift but under control. He is a child there, and not sure why. The cop looked up, his countenance hardening. Back off, and cautioned, his voice maniac, or you may find yourself on the ground next. Neglecting the menace, David approached, his presence hovering above the officer sufficient. He said his tone was out of line and left no space for debate. The tension, David and the cop arrived to a breaking point, and it was obvious that a confrontation was approaching. But before either could act, Emma put a hand on David's shoulder, dragging him back. Not as this woman. Her voice was firm despite her hand shaking. We cannot offer them an excuse. The officer grinned, as though pleased by David's appearance. Retreating, he gave the lad one last nudge before walking away, shaking the young man but not injuring the episode, however, had only served to intensify the anxiety and resentment among the people there. Saw enough to know the cops had no desire in calmly settling the matter for. Some found it intolerable to see their loved ones treated like criminals, hence some started to speak out more, aggressively seeking responses, demanding justice. The officials handling the one officer started to move in with more violence as mounting resistance started, pulled his baton, and walked over to an old mother begging for her grandson's freedom. "Ma'am, move back." He yelled, his tone without sympathy, when she stopped her delicate hand.
Ass.
David spotted the motion and reached toward her grandson, raising the baton menacingly. Raced ahead, grabbing the officer's wrist just before he could hit. He muttered, his voice low and deadly. The officer's eyes grew wide. "You will not touch her." Furious in the next second, he yelled for backup and attacked me. The officer screamed, his voice across the yard, getting him down. Numerous cops hurried in, knocking David back. The scenario collapsed into anarchy as the visitors tried. While some people battled, some yelling at the police to halt. Police response was quick and forceful, protecting their loved ones by seized David, dragging him to the ground. Emma screamed in terror. Her husband, a man committed his life to defend others, was receiving treatment. As though he were a terrible criminal, Emma tried to pass her way through to David, but she was stopped by two cops who blocked her route, their features frigid, and one of them said, "Unyielding, you're blocking justice. Step aside, justice." Rising with frustration, Emma shot back, her voice, "This is not justice." She could feel tears welling up in her eyes as she broke our riots, but she stayed tough. One cop reached for her arm, but this was far from done. She twisted out of his grasp, her face fierce. "Don't you dare touch," she cautioned, and for a time the officer stopped, surprised by the passion in her eyes. But the police closed. The moment of doubt was fleeting. One of them was seizing her wrist and twisting it behind her back when another pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "You under arrest," he said, the phrase repeating with finality. As Emma was being restrained, she turned to look over David, still battling the police, dragging him down. The sight of her husband, the man who had always been a defender, now being treated so unfairly, ripped at. She swallowed back a sob, resolved not to let them see her. Not sparing anyone who broke the rules, the police started detaining other visitors as also daring to express their unhappiness. Even the kids were taken away and faced with detention should they refuse cooperate. The sense of helplessness was overpowering, as though the air itself had swelled with dread, choking any. David put hope for a quiet ending under two cops, raised his head and met Emma's stare, then stated, his voice hardly audible over the tumult, "We will get through this." His words gave her a flutter of power, and she nodded, attempting to communicate via her reply. She would not give up, not now, but as the night. Not now, but rather as wore on and the sounds of fight resounded across the yard. It was obvious they were confronting a force devoid of readily give up. The chapter ends from the previously joyous setting, now transformed into anarchy and worry. The bride and groom split apart and handled like ordinary criminals. Emma and David have to face not just the officer's physical hostility, but also the deeper, more subtle fight against a system that considered their rights as the previously lovely backyard now felt expendable. The night had settled entirely, more akin to a battle zone than a celebration venue. Flashing lights from the police vehicles created long, menacing shadows across the grass, and the air seemed to be dense with the echoes of angry, shouting voices, both of which represent every command screamed by an officer. There was a dire plea from a visitor or company declaration of rights. The more individuals tried to reason with, the more hostile the cops grew. Emma's wrist remained still, cuffed behind her back, battled to be cool despite the excruciating arm ache the officer had limited her, had been excessively forceful, twisting her wrist to a painful angle before pushing her hands into the cuffs she was familiar with, but having personally encountered such obvious disrespect for justice was completely separate matter. David was pinned on the ground by two cops. His suit was rumpled and filthy from the battle, Yet his voice stayed consistent. "You have no justification for arresting us," he said. Words strained but clear. "We have done no crimes. We are not resisting. Let us be released." One of the cops pushing him down looked up with a smirk. "You people never consider to be in the wrong." Dear words flow with scorn, and underlying meaning was clearly visible before David's reply was disturbance from behind. Several visitors had gathered their voices, rising in a chorus of outrage. "Let them go," they shouted. "This is incorrect." Emma grabbed the instant she focused on the lead officer. Her eyes scanned the assembly. With an increasing annoyance, she yelled out, her voice transcending the noise, "I demand to speak as a judge regarding the legality. Your acts violate not only our rights but the law itself as well. You are searching and arresting without any justification or warrant." The jaw-tightened lead cop. Then he moved in front of her. His eyes went icy as he said, "Ma'am, this is..." He paused to consider a police inquiry. "You wouldn't be able to control how we handled it." Look at his colleagues, cops then add, "And just because you're judge doesn't imply the guidelines bend for you." Emma's heart hammered with frustration, but she drew herself as best she could despite her restrained hands. "I'm not asking you to break the rules." Her voice is steady but forceful. "You have no right to hold us, search us, or otherwise. I am requesting that you obey them." Arriving to our house without a warrant, the cop responded immediately and violently. "Get her out of here. She may make speeches if she so want." From a jail, 2 police seized her by the arms and started dragging her toward. She stumbled from one of the squad cars because of their roughness of grip, but she caught herself, her jaw closed against the agony as she was being yanked away. Emma's voice boomed once more. "You only proved our point. This isn't extended execution, it's misuse of authority." While David saw with growing fear as his wife was hauled towards the police vehicles he battled against officers pinning him down, his rage provide you with a boost of power. "Hands off her," he yelled desperately, and the cops answered with forcing him even further against the ground. "You are not in control here," one of they hissed tightly. "So keep down." Seeing his wife treated so carefully forcefully drove David to the brink. He could not remain calm as an agent who had vowed to respect the law. Now he was only a guy battling to thrust himself upward from the earth, protecting his wife with a sudden will. Just enough to release one of the officer's grips. The movement let him stumble to his knees. The officer dragging him down staggered back and rapidly regained his baton and raised it menacingly. "I told him to keep down." He barked forward toward David, and it was in that instant as David reached up and the officer's baton swung down, deflected the hit with his forearm, and the impact shocked him with agony. But he held his ground. Sufficient of this, and spoke low and loaded with regulated fury. "We have rights to protect." Other cops who watched David rising started to gather around him, their faces twisted in will to subjugate him once more. Emma, observing from the edge of the yard, experienced a wave of terror and rage that overwhelmed her. Suffering, she refused to be useless in this, as she couldn't stand by and see David wounded. Drawing on every bit of her training and will, Emma yelled battle over the anarchy. "Stop now. You are violating everyone's civil rights right now. This will not go." Unpack led. Her declaration seemed to strike across the darkness of the night, giving the cops a brief pause for an there was stillness right away, as if her comments had momentarily struck everyone. Then, just as the lead officer suddenly straightened himself and gave his soldiers commands. "Take them all. If they wish to fight, we will also take everything else we can find." He shouted, "Charge them with obstruction. Give them cause to remember tonight." The words were a call to arms. Many more guests were arrested for the police, who doubled their efforts. Even the children were not spared from the anarchy. Their shouts of protest were muffled by the officer's directives. Thus, some were driven from their parents and ended up with the side David. And Emma felt overwhelmed and pressed down once more, trying to defend herself, and Emma noticed a rising intensity in the fight. View of one of her elderly relatives being forced roughly toward a patrol car, and another child being taken away from his mother's. Tears pouring down his face set off a deep-seated wrath. "You believe you can treat us like this without repercussions?" she spat. Her voice carries a mix of anguish and wrath. "We will not be quiet nor hushed." Intimidated, her defiance just appeared to inspire the police further, and one of them, in an effort to quiet her, slammed her violently to the ground. The collision caused a searing flash of pain through her shoulder, but she refused to let them see her frail. She battled to her feet once more, using every bit of strength to improve. The state has dropped to a level beyond everyone's control. What had begun as a happy celebration had become a terrible suffering defined by cruelty and injustice. David and Emma, once hopeful and happy, now found themselves opposing a system set to break them. The conflict now transcended their own freedom to include revealing power abuse and supporting everyone who had been victimized. That evening, the chapter ends with Emma and David among the chaos, stained but lowered their eyes, full of a defiance that resisted to be extinguished. The fight was far from finished. As they ascended the frigid steps of the police, they knew one thing was certain: they would not give up no matter what the cost. The air hummed with tension as David and Emma stood boldly. They were beaten and restrained among the anarchy, yet their spirits stayed. Shattered the flashing lights from the squad cars to match their resolute expressions, and the darkness reflected with yells of indignation and hopelessness among the visitors. Seeing a celebration turned into a nightmare. The cops had taken over the scene, or so it appeared. David's attempt to recover his equilibrium would cause the tide to turn, something they were unaware of. Breath from the rough touched Emma's eye in that instant to quiet. Knowing flowed between them. They had been pushed to their boundaries, and now it was time to show who they really were. Were not only targets of this misuse of authority, but also people who carried notable authority in their own right. It was time to face the officers with a reality. They could not ignore Emma's voice, raspy from screaming, straightened herself as best she could. "Despite the suffering, you believe you can avoid doing this without consequences," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You have no idea who you're addressing." The commanding cop, who had directed the forceful responses, stepped forward, his attitude a mix of annoyance and arrogance. "Lady, I don't care who you think like the rest of them," Emma sneering. "You are under custody." Eyes gleamed with a strong will. "I am Judge Emma Turner," declaring, her voice piercing the air with obvious power. "I have spent more than 10 years on the bench. Years, and I know the law better than anyone here. What you're doing is not what I would advise. Only illegal." The revelation seemed to strike a clear, egregious transgression of our civil rights. Led officer like a punch to the gut. For a little flash of smugness, suddenly replaced by a flutter of doubt, he peered at the other police, some of whom looked uneasy, as though starting to understand the weight of the matter. Yet Emma was not done. She went to David, who had maintained his dignity in face of still surrounding police. "And this is my husband, David Turner." She kept her voice getting more forceful with every word. "He is not simply any old citizen, but a high-ranking official. Agent with the FBI." The weight of her remarks appeared to drop like a stone, producing a wave of shock that swept across the assembly, even among the visitors who had known the couple for years. She had not expected the effects this revelation would have on the officers. Still, they clearly shook and looked in wonder and unease, obviously trying to understand what they had just discovered. The lead officer's face hardened with wrath. "You believe your titles make you untouchable?" he snapped in an attempt to control the circumstances. Nothing changed. David's speech sounded calm. "But you are still meddling with a research project. It had a deadly edge. You might call this an inquiry. You came here without a warrant, harassed our visitors, and applied too strong force to unarmed people, including children and the elderly people. Do you really believe that won't return to haunt you?" His words were like a frigid breeze slicing through the heat of the confrontation. The other cops moved uncomfortably. Some of them peered at the squad cars where numerous guests were still being arrested. Their confidence was obviously starting to fade, and Emma used the opportunity to surge forward. She gestured toward the audience where numerous visitors had gathered. "Moreover, everything you have done here has been noted." Caught the whole episode on their phones. "These recordings are already being shared to the media and our legal team. This is no longer under your control. The face of the senior officer flushed. Red with fury, he moved forward, Emma lowering his voice to A. You might be an agent and he might be a judge, but out here that does not mean a damn thing. Emma held his eye without. She answered coolly, your behavior tonight, flinching, we will see about that, will. Checked by more than just this department. There will be in research, and I promise heads will roll, as if on cue. Multiple of the guests, those who had been videotaping the situation, started to speak loudly, supporting David and Emma Shees. One man yelled, you cannot treat people like this simply because you have a badge. Let them go. Another woman yelled, they haven't done anything wrong. The outrage seemed to knock off the final traces of the officer's authority over the situation. Some of the younger cops, seeming scared, started to back off. Others traded uneasy whispers, their early swagger melting in the face of growing public scrutiny. Investigation observing the change David chose to move forward, he turned to. If you wish to save what remains of your careers, approach the officials personally. Everyone now and leave. Otherwise, I guarantee each one of you will be mentioned in the cases posing a threat that hang mostly in the air. And for the first time that evening, uncertainty crept into the expressions of even the most rebellious. Officers seemed to be starting to understand the reality that this was not only one occurrence, but rather one of the senior cops, an explosive scandal ready to strike. Graying hair and a tired look in his eyes, moved forward. This has gone far enough, he muttered, said softly. His voice revealed a trace of regret we should be aware of. De-escalate. The lead police rounded on him, his face one of incredulity. While the older officer shook, rage de-escalates the resistance they have been resisting all this time. His head no, his tone was stern. They have been claiming their rights and we have been neglecting them. We must pull back. The assertion hanging in the air like a sudden quiet following a storm was acknowledgement of the reality that had been there all along, a fact that one could not overlook or deny. The other cops started to relax their grips on and drop their weapons. The restricted visitors helped the atmosphere to change from one of approaching violence for David and Emma, one of uneasy truce. Their wrists still shackled, but their determination intact. They had shown who they were, not only in terms of their titles and roles, but as people who defied silence in the face of injustice. They had exposed the conceit and challenged the misuse of authority. Among those who felt they could act with impunity, the chapter finishes with the police starting to let the visitors go, the weight of what had just happened hovering strongly in the air. Emma and David stayed determined, knowing that although this fight was, while the struggle for justice was almost over, the effects of this were just starting to show. This evening would go well beyond the backyard, echoing through the court of public opinion and the legal system. Opinion. The police started to distance themselves from the subdued visitors, their faces a mixture of shame and anxiety. The elderly officer, who had urged deferential behavior, nodded curtly to his associates, telling them to begin taking the handcuffs off the visitors, comprising. Though the tension in the air began to relax, the atmosphere stayed heavy. Emma and David. Emma caressed her aching wrist, now free from the metal restraints, weighing what had happened. Felt the surge of relief tinged with a steely will to undo the harm done, and no amount of releasing their visitors would remove the horror of the night. She exchanged a glance with David, who was likewise releasing the same will burned in his eyes. They both knew that they both knew justice had to be given. The visitors crowded around, monitoring one another and providing solace to the youngsters who had been split from their parents. The setting seems less chaotic than earlier. Still, car bore the traces of anarchy and terror. Several visitors carried on to record every moment as evidence of the evening's events for movies. Emma moved up and spoke to the officials using the weight of her authority. We are not completed here, she said, the tone of a judge rendering a decision to every one of you engaged in illegal activity. Your badges won't shield you. The lead cop. Conduct will suffer consequences. There will be an investigation. Those who had been the target of the anger all night sought to gather a last defense. You people were resisting, he replied, but his voice lacked the intensity it had possessed previously. We were simply doing our jobs. David cutting. Your job is to defend, and in his voice loud and full of contempt, Serve not to frighten innocent individuals attending a private event you are acting on unfounded charges, and let your prejudice control your behavior not in line with the law. Enforcement using abuse of authority as his remarks sank in the officers. Defiance opened his mouth in irritation, wavering his jaw in frustration. Answer, but before he could say, another cop, the one who had first asked for de-escalation, moved. Onward, it's over, the older cop remarked silently, glancing at David and Emma. Apologies hanged in this, never should have happened. The air real, but inadequate to undo the damage. Emma held his eye for a time. She answered, "You're right. Shouldn't have. Now there will be." Her look was relentless. Word of the tragedy had already started to travel outside the garden, and guest recordings from had become popular rapidly on social media and drew within hours, news sources' attention would turn the narrative into a headline inciting indignation. Legal ramifications started almost everywhere in the nation. Right away, Emma and David, with their powerful families' help, filed official complaints against the involved police using incident footage. Key became the obvious abuse of force and violation of civil rights. Evidence supporting the growing case against the police agency, the society mobilized B. The evening's events gathered around the pair, advocating justice and demanding responsibility. Inquiries started at the local and federal levels. David's ties inside the FBI helped to guarantee that the investigation would not be thrown under the carpet. The activities of the police under close examination there. Records looked at for past misbehavior starting in a neighborhood. Disturbing call had now developed into a full-fledged scandal spanning far outside the purview of one police department, the lead officer having been administrative leave until the outcome was assigned to the most hostile during the confrontation. Based on his earlier record, which included allegations of too forceful treatment, when racial prejudice surfaced, casting a sinister shadow over his career many of years ago. The other cops involved were also suspended as their behavior could be seen in public view. While this is under review, the narrative of the wedding becomes a nightmare that connects with individuals all throughout the country, triggering talks of racial bias in law enforcement and police reform between Emma and David, themselves at the core of an expanding movement aiming to question the systematic problems allowing such misuse of authority to continue. In the weeks following, the legal procedure started to unravel. David and Emma and their legal team ready to take their objective in court was not merely to pursue justice for the damage their visitors had caused, harmed, but wanted to create a precedent against future misbehavior, so ensuring that the cops and the mechanism allowing their actions were held accountable. Responsible, the courtroom turned into a battlefield for the truth witnesses. From the wedding, they related their horror they had gone through and the too forceful police actions. Court was shown the indiscriminate aggressiveness toward unarmed people using the night's footage. People, including elderly people and little children, the footage left minimal space for the defense to contend that the officer's behavior had been justified. Emma stood not merely as a victim but also acting as a legal expert, therefore wielding the power of her work, compiling the several legal infractions carried out that evening. Considering the long-lasting effects it had on all those in attendance, her evidence was strong. A judge who has personally gone through the misuse of authority now applying her. David, too, testified using his background as an FBI agent, strongly denouncing it. He detailed the correct procedures should have been followed and how the officer's behavior had strayed from every conceivable norm. His comments had the weight of someone who had devoted his life to law enforcement and understood what it meant to maintain the law with integrity. The case attracted much attention with civil rights organizations and community leaders supporting Emma and David. The trial came to represent the fight against systematic injustice, gathering people in the demand of meaningful reform. Finally, the jury decided in David's and Emma's favor that the cops had violated the couple's civil rights and behaved with too great force and racial prejudice. The police department was exposed with, compelled to pay large damages, and several officials dealt with disciplinary steps, include firing and maybe criminal charges. The lead officer in particular was accused of misbehavior, ending his law. Following the decision rendered, Emma and David stood outside the enforcement career courthouse surrounded by reporters and fans. The path to this event had been exhausting, but they had come out triumphant, not only for themselves, but also for others. Everyone who had ever been unfairly singled out understood that the struggle for, though justice was far from done, this triumph was a major turning point in the right route. Emma said to the assembly, her voice calm and determined. Today we show that none, not even those sworn to enforce the law, are above it. We shall keep battling for justice for every person, not only for ourselves. Someone who has been mistreated or overlooked. Just the David stood beside her, his arm encircling her shoulders as they faced the cameras and the throng. The ordeal had tried their endurance, but it also had confirmed their dedication to one another and to the cause they currently work for. Supported as they held their way from the courthouse, realized that their tale had evolved into a beacon of hope for the continuous fight for equality and had changed everything. Justice ends the chapter with a triumph and a fresh will to question the injustices that continue. The struggle had not been simple, but it had been required. When David and Emma carried ahead with "Thank you for viewing," their knowing that their bravery had contributed to bring about actual change is invaluable. Liked this narrative and would want more? Make sure you subscribe to the channel to avoid missing fresh videos. Kindly like us. Please leave your ideas in the comments. Additionally, remember not to overlook to view the more videos on our channel. See you in the upcoming stories. Disclaimer: this channel is opposed to all forms of discrimination, bigotry, intolerance, and human rights violations. The narratives presented here are original works that were crafted to foster constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. The production of all content is guided by a dedication to the preservation of human dignity and the respect for diversity.